Game 5 of the World Chess Championship was played today between Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. So I want to pick it up here on move 8. We've seen this position now for the third time in this tournament. Jan played e4, we moved into this Ruy Lopez, and in game 1 we saw Jan play h3, in game 2 he played a4, and today he also went with pawn to a4, another one of these so-called anti-martial systems where you don't play pawn to c3. And Magnus now was the first to deviate. So in game 2 he played rook to e8 and his position was fine, but Magnus probably expected that Jan would have something prepared there with maybe knight g5 or who knows what. So Magnus went rook to b8 instead. Jan now chopped on b5, the pawn recaptured, and he then played h3 here. So there's lots of overlapping ideas in these positions and move order nuances. That's why they're such rich positions. Magnus played pawn to d6. We had c3 now from Jan. Pawn to b4 now from Magnus, looking to rip open that b file for his rook. And we had pawn to d3 from Jan now. This is an instructive moment because you might think it makes sense to play pawn to d4 immediately. But the problem here is not that black takes there first, because then you recapture and you've got a nice centre. But instead, if black takes on c3, after the recapture here, then you take, and this time the b file is opened. So that's why Jan doesn't push d4. Instead he goes d3 because he has a small advantage in space here. The pawns are equal in the centre, but he does have an established pawn on c3. Black doesn't have a counterpart on c6, and therefore this gives Jan access to the d5 square, which Magnus doesn't have on d4. We had b takes on c3 now, pawn recaptures, and the immediate d5 in the centre now from Magnus, breaking as soon as he can. And again, this is instructive, so you might think that white can simply take here, and after knight recaptures, knight takes on e5, knight takes, rook takes, and white's just won a pawn. Why wouldn't you go in for this? But the reason is very tactical. After bishop e6, black now has a lot of threats. So one threat is to take on c3, hitting the queen, and then also uncovering this attack on the bishop, which is attacked by the rook here. And the second threat that black has got is connected with this diagonal. So if you retreat the bishop to c2, then we have bishop to f6. And after the rook retreats, the knight's taking here. So this is why if you went in for this, after bishop e6, you'd probably have to take this knight. And after bishop recaptures, you've got the bishop pair, white has development issues, and so black should be fine here. So coming back here, that's why Jan didn't go in for any of this stuff. Instead of taking on d5, he played knight b to d2 instead, just developing that knight and preparing to improve it. We had pawn takes now from Magnus, pawn recaptures, bishop to d6 now to overprotect e5, and now a nice move by Jan, he plays queen to c2. So he's preparing to bring a rook to the d file later, and he's also leaving his bishop on b3 here rather than dropping that piece back. A, because it's powerful along this diagonal, but B, it hampers black's natural development plans, because say black goes something like queen to e7 here to bring the rook across, well now it runs into bishop d5, and you can't take here because after recaptures your knight is stumbling around, it would have to go to d8 for example. So it keeps these kind of latent threats in the position, keeping the tension, and you could see that Jan was playing for more today in how he was playing the game. So Magnus played h6, a very standard move. We had knight to f1, knight to e7, and now knight to g3, completing that knight's journey from b1. We had knight to g6 now, again a very common manoeuvre in these Ruy Lopez structures. We had bishop to e3 here, and this is a nice move from Jan, preparing now to push this c-pawn potentially if black isn't careful. Queen to e8 now from Magnus, so he's setting up the intention of bishop e6 to trade off this dangerous light squared bishop. And now Jan plays a little routinely, arguably, so he plays rook e to d1 here, not a bad move in and of itself, but he could have considered pushing c4. So this is threatening to come to c5, and however black reacts, he's going to be compromising. So if you come out to b4 hitting the rook, now we slide across, and because this bishop could come under fire soon, you might have to go pawn to c5 anyway, but then you've weakened d6 and shut the bishop out of the game. And if instead you react to this threat by going pawn to c5, well now you've got a bad bishop, it's just a big pawn. So possibly Jan could have looked at that, but instead he played rook e to d1. Magnus now played bishop to e6. Bishop a4 from Jan, a kind of pseudo threat to keep the position alive, but Magnus drops back very solidly here. Knight to d2 from Jan, so he's improving that knight, looking at the c4 square. We had bishop takes from Magnus, queen recaptures, queens come off, rook recaptures, and now rook to a8, just challenging that open file. So unfortunately the position is simplifying here. We had rook d to a1, the rooks get chopped off, Magnus goes rook b8, rook a6 here, and now a really nice defensive exhibition from Magnus. Look at how he rearranges his pieces now. So he starts with knight e8 to lend support to this bishop. We have king f1 from Jan, knight f8 from Magnus, looking to re-maneuver to e6. We have knight f5 from Jan, knight e6 from Magnus, knight to c4 from Jan. So now there's a lot of pressure against this square. Rook to d8, pawn to f3, pawn to f6 from Magnus. So he's solidifying this chain now that the knights have moved. Pawn to g4, king to f7, pawn to h4 now. And now the bishop just slides back to f8, clearing this square for one of the knights to come forward and exchange pieces and head towards a draw. King e2 from Jan, knight into d6 now. Knight c takes on d6, there really isn't much better in this position. We had bishop recaptures, pawn to h5, bishop drops back to f8, and now rook to a5, trying to activate into this d5 square. King comes back to e8, rook into d5, and Magnus now declines the exchange, comes to the open file because he doesn't want to give white these passed pawns here. Jan now goes rook to d1, the rook comes into a2, and now we have this repetition of moves that finishes the game like this. So unfortunately Jan couldn't break through today, despite having Magnus under a little bit of pressure in the middle game there. If you enjoyed this video, then hit subscribe here, and to see more Magnus videos, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.